What's going on, everybody? Tim from Tierphone Orbital. So I would like to go over an install commission that I completed a few days ago for a Vaults of Valhalla Valkyrie. Now, I've done this same install on a Valkyrie previously. It's almost been a month, I think, since I did the last Valkyrie. So this is the same install. It is a resin chassis with some printed brass parts. This was my first time, not for this particular install, but designing the chassis for this hilt was the first time that I started to dip my toes into the metal chassis, hybrid metal slash resin slash FDM chassis arena, and I was really, really happy with the result. Luckily for me, the client for this particular install was okay with going this route as well. So the client sent me this hilt. It was previously installed. It was like halfway installed. It wasn't like complete. So the client did want to try to retain some of the functionality of the original install and did have some requests as well. However, with this particular chassis, so the original install was a 2-button setup and was a little interesting the way that the chassis was modified to allow for 2 buttons. But with this particular chassis, it is a single button setup with this hilt as well. I mean, so the upper section of the hilt has one plunger spring button. So I wasn't able to get like a secondary switch on the chassis itself. And again, like luckily for me, this client was very, very easy to work with, and they were fine with, going back to a single button setup. Single button with Proffie, you get all of the same functionality that you get with a 2-button. It's just a little bit more, it's different accessing the menus and everything, obviously, right? So I'm not too schooled on single button Proffie. I do know how to activate, deactivate, and scroll through fonts, but there is a whole data sheet that FET offers for the single button navigation. It's also in the prop file folder. So anyhow, this client was to my, I always appreciate it when I get a client that's easy to work with and that it is receptive of ideas and changes. So super appreciative of that. And this was just another beautiful Vaults of Valhalla hilt to work on, right? So let's come up top. Actually, no, let's come into Fusion really quick. I know I went over this chassis before, but I did want to spend a little bit more time talking about my design process for some of these parts, and then we'll come up top and do a demo, right? So, okay, so here is the chassis for this particular hilt. This is for the Vaults of Valhalla Valkyrie. So this was, like I said, this was my first time jumping into the metal chassis parts game, okay? I keep talking about this and I keep mentioning it, and I should probably just stop talking about it and do it. I've been meaning to do a shaper chassis design, class or series of videos to talk about what my design process is. I'm at like 85 to 90% of my chassis and metal parts are all done in Shaper. And then I import it into Fusion to do some final tweaks. I also appreciate that Fusion can keep all of my files in one place. I'm more organized that way. But yeah, the majority of all my designing is done in Shaper. Okay, so the way that I went about designing this particular chassis and the parts was a little bit complicated to explain. It would just be a lot easier if I showed people how to do it, right? But essentially, like I know that I want a cover for my battery. And the way that I did that was just kind of taking an estimate on how thick I wanted the brass parts to be. I think they're like 2 mils thick, right? So, basically I just cut a kidney-shaped hole at the bottom of my tube, my chassis, my blank, right? And just cut an entire half circle section out of the chassis itself or out of the model, and then remove that and then start designing the chassis around it, right? So you don't want to like have your battery tray resting where you would usually have it, because you're going to have a cover on top of it. Nothing will fit if you do that, right? So basically I'm just cutting out slices, removing them, and then importing them as their own model and doing all of the designing on them, right? Really, really happy with this design. I've got like little flathead screws in here. You know, I think my original intention with this window was to maybe put like a brass mesh behind it, but I just like being able to see some exposed components, right? So held in place with magnets, far overkill with 4 magnets on each side. So with this particular install, I only put 2. These are 3mm neodymium magnets. They're super strong, so you only need 2. And this is another thing, you know, when I was designing this chassis, I knew after working with some of Goth 3D's stuff and some of the other intricate metal chassis, you don't want everything to be exact, right? So, you know, I know these are 3mm magnets. These are not 3mm holes. I mean, I would definitely end up having to either file or open up the holes with a drill bit. So I make these holes a little bit bigger. They're like a 3.1mm or something like that. Even like where this brass piece marries into the chassis, like this section is a little bit bigger than this because you want a little bit of play. Otherwise, it's going to have a hard time fitting together. Having everything super precise would make sense if I had maybe like a full metal chassis. And even then, I would want some amount of play, right? And the same application applies for this upper crystal chamber cover, right? I just kind of made a slice out of the model and brought it out and then went around designing it. Just cut some vents in it, added some resistors, some capacitors, whatever those are. And that's it. Did my greebly work around both sides of the chassis. Down at the bottom here, we've got a 28mm speaker. This is from Smugglers Outpost. I have my wire channel going up the spine of the chassis, and that goes all the way up past the crystal chamber into this area where the Proffie board is. I do have one single NeoPixel up top above the crystal. I have a channel so that where the positive battery terminal goes, I've got another little channel that I fish through, bringing up the back of the crystal up to where the Proffie board is. We do have a kill switch along this side, tilted Proffie board setup. So the way that I've spaced this Proffie board, it sits just underneath the threads of the hilt itself. So you can unthread the grip and easily get to your Proffie board. This is where our single button, this is a single red button tactile, and that is where we make a connection to the plunger, the spring-loaded plunger switch on the outside of the hilt. All right, that's it. Super complicated chassis. I had a really good time designing this chassis. I was really, really proud of the result, and now I think I might offer that as an option to all of my installs going forward. Even though it's a little bit more labor intensive, it takes a lot longer to design components like this than just a regular chassis. But yeah, really, really happy with the result. And having the ability to send stuff to Craftcloud and have it printed rather than Shapeways is great, right? It's a more cost-friendly solution than Shapeways. So anyhow, enough about that. Let's come up top, take a look at this hilt. So this is it. This is a Valkyrie from Vaults of Valhalla. Absolutely beautiful hilt. Every time I get anything powder-coated and etched from Carl or from Vaults of Valhalla, it's art. So to me, right, looking at this is artwork. I mean, this is functional sculpture to me. All of the powder coating and etching is beautiful, very detailed. We've got rhinestones that are embedded in the hilt as well, in the pommel here. I mean, it's just beautiful. Beautiful shroud work, right? Phenomenal hilt. Super, super unique hilt. All right, so anyhow. So initially, the old install, it wasn't complete. There was like a halfway done install in this. The client had a chassis with a recharge port in this hole, right? There is a very, very small pilot hole in here as well, and that is how the client accessed the aux button on the chassis. So there was another button on the inside, and he just stuck a pin in there to get the aux button. So we foregoed that. We did not do that. Just a single button setup, but we do get some cool, you know, there's like the brass parts are viewable in that hole, right? So to get at your chassis, you want to unthread the grip, a little bit of a tight fit here. And there is the chassis, right? So we've got our brass parts here, brass crystal chamber cover. They're all held in place with neodymium magnets. Here is our Proffie board, really, really handy, dandy, tilted Proffie board setup, so you can easily get to your USB and your SD card, right? And that's it. Battery trays around front. So to use the hilt, spring side is your negative. Take the flat part of your battery, put it in that battery tray, hit that kill switch, put your battery cover on, put your grip on. It is a tight build, right? Tighten your grip till it stops, and you're ready to go. So I should probably show that crystal. Crystal is lit. It has its own animation in the blade config or in the font config. Really interesting fonts. So let's come down to the bottom. The client did send a few fonts along with this. So the old install already had the SD card, right? So their fonts, actually the fonts are already there. But another thing that I really appreciated about this particular upgrade or install is that the client provided the config. I think this is the first time that a client has done this, and it was greatly appreciated. Right, so the client already had a config written that they wanted. Obviously, I had to modify it just slightly to add the crystal chamber into the config itself. But you know, everything was ready to go. Another thing that I forgot to mention, right? The client did request that this be Bluetooth enabled. So there is a Bluetooth module just above the chassis in this area between the chassis and the PCB emitter. So it is Bluetooth enabled and ready to go. The password for the Bluetooth has not been changed. It's just the stock password for that particular model. I think it's like 6 zeros or 4 zeros or 4 ones or 6 ones, something like that. It's the stock password, right? So with me, Bluetooth is a cool functionality to have, right? But with Proffie board, it's not as robust as it is with CFX. Like, so with CFX, you can really, you can change blade color, I believe. You can get really detailed. You can wirelessly config your CFX, I believe, as well with Bluetooth. With Proffie board, you can do that stuff through Rice, I believe, but it's not as robust as it is. I think this might, yeah. This might have swing to activate. That's why it keeps going on. So anyhow, with Bluetooth, it's great with Proffie board. You can turn the blade on, turn it off. You can change fonts. You can edit your volume, but it's not yet to the place where it is with CFX. Is where I'm getting at with that, right? So let's see what else we put on here. It's a great sounding hilt as well. So let's put a blade in this really quick. One thing I do want to mention to the client. So with these hilts, right? So the last Valkyrie that I did, the shroud screws were short. They were short and they did not protrude into the inside of the hilt. With your hilt, these are pretty long screws. I mean, they're almost an inch long, okay? And that's fine for these two bottom ones. But up here, they're too long. They will go into the blade, right? So I'm going to utilize one of them as blade retention, but to the client, you might want to look into either contacting Vaults of Valhalla for shorter screws or getting what size screws they are. They almost, strangely enough, these screws look like skateboard truck screws to me. They're like anodized blue, but anyhow, you want shorter ones that don't go all the way into the emitter here, or they're going to hit the blade and you're not going to be able to put your blade in, right? So anyhow, let's put a blade in it. Okay, so this is a 1-inch blade holder. Just rest your blade on those PCB pins. I've put the long screw in already. I've pre-threaded it. So I'm going to use that as my blade retention. So if you can see on camera, it does stick up just a little bit, right? Really interesting fonts on here. I don't think I've heard the majority of this. So let's put. Christmas themed font on there. All right, so that's it. Interesting font selection. I also, again, like I appreciate that the config was already provided, like all the blade styles were provided and all that. So really, really handy. I appreciate that to the client. So anyhow, to the client, thank you very much for trusting me and choosing to go with this install. I really am proud of this chassis. A hilt like this, in my opinion, a work of art like this, does deserve a reveal chassis, if you will. So really, really happy with the way that this turned out. And that's all I got, everybody. So anyhow, thank you very much for watching. If anyone has any questions about this particular hilt or the install, please do not be a stranger. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. May the force be with you always. Have a good one.